What's up, poker homies? It's Navanata, No Limit Hold'em. How do? So a few days ago, I started to email and text the students that I've worked with over the last few months a question. I asked them for a question. I intended to do a Q&A video as something of like a bonus, a little bit of an extra little something for the people that have done coaching sessions. And I actually, I was planning on making a video about as many questions and answers as I could get to, and maybe then I have to make another video at some point. But I wasn't really expecting there to be any kind of connection or correlation to work them together into a video that sort of made any sense other than these are the questions I got from these players, so I'm going to answer them. But I actually think that the questions that I got, they did sort of go together. So let's take a look at them. Yeah, so I only got 4 questions, and they only came from 3 different people, so far anyway. And what was interesting is that they all had sort of a central theme. How should we size our C-bets? How do we know if the flop or board is good for pre-flop raiser or pre-flop caller? Should we ever donk lead the flop, and if so, when and why? And the other question that was asked by one of the people who asked one of these other 3 questions that fit more easily together. But the other question was, which street should I tend to raise my sets on? Should I generally raise sets on flop, or wait till the turn, or even wait till the river? And how do I know when to do what? And so I think that these 4 questions really can, they're different enough that the connection might not be completely obvious, but there is a common thread here. And I think the common thread is simply that people just aren't sure how to compare their pre-flop ranges to the flops, and then deduce based on that, based on the equity distributions that each player will be working with, what that should mean for their strategy, or how that should affect their overall strategy. Like, when to c-bet, when to donk bet, when to check back, and if we're going to c-bet, should we be using a small size or a big size, and which hands should we use, and so on and so forth. So the common thread here is these are questions about how ranges interact with, like pre-flop ranges interact with the flop. That's really kind of what we're asking here. Now, of course, I could just answer these 4 questions and move on, and that would be maybe easier. It certainly wouldn't take as long, but I feel like there's enough in common that we've got some material to make an actual video. So yeah, c-bet sizing, very basically, just to answer the question. In a single raise pot, we want to typically bet a higher percent of pot, because the implied odds are based more on the stack to pot ratio, like how much money is behind, determines your implied odds. And one of the objectives when you bet is you don't want to give your opponent really good implied odds to make calls that you can actually make them mistakes if you go bigger. So like if I'm going to have a lot of like top pairs on a board, and my opponent's going to have a bunch of gut shots, if I don't have very much money behind, then we don't have so much incentive to bet big to kind of deny our opponent their equity. But if we've got big stacks behind, then I do kind of have to make a chunky bet, or my opponent is not making a mistake should he or she decide to call the bet. So for that reason and for other reasons, and we're going to get into this, so I don't think we need to start off quite as complicated, but we could just say in single raised pots we want to bet a higher percent of the size of the pot. 3-bet pots, of course, we're going to c-bet a smaller percent. So maybe your standard c-bet, continuation bet in 3-bet pots at 100 big blind effective starting stacks could look something like 1/3 pot to 1/2 pot. Whereas in a single raise pot, maybe your standard would be 2/3 of the size of the pot to a full size of the pot, and then maybe Sometimes you'd go as small as 1/2 the size of the pot. Now, this also depends on how much money you guys have behind, of course. In fact, that's the biggest reason that there's a difference between 3-bet pots and single raise pots to begin with, is the stack to pot ratio that's remaining. And also, if you're going to be betting a polarized range, you want to bet bigger. And if you're betting a wider, more linear range, so you're going to be betting more hands within your range, you want to use a smaller sizing. And on volatile boards, we want to use bigger bets because we're going to have more semi-bluffs that benefit from fold equity, and our opponents will have more draws, so we'll have more value targets, and we'll need to use bigger bets to deny more equity. And on static boards, we can afford to bet smaller, and smaller bets will get the job done. Pre-flop raiser versus pre-flop caller. Okay, so this is a little bit harder to just give a general rule of thumb on, because it depends on the positions, it depends on the stack sizes, it depends on the specific strategies of the players involved. I mean, if we're playing heads up and open raiser or pre-flop raiser, let's say is the button, is opening, I don't know, for 2.5 times the big blind with 80% of their starting hands, and the player that's defending the big blind is not 3-betting very often, calling a bunch, and maybe his range doesn't look all that much different than pre-flop raiser, then it's really kind of, it becomes a little trickier to say whose board is whose. Once there's a 3-bet dynamic that's in play, and depending on the bet sizing, that can change. But it's not going to be the same as in a full ring game, when under the gun open raiser, when the open raiser is under the gun in a full ring game, he opens for, say, 4 times the big blind and gets called by the button. Or even if he opens for 3 times the big blind and gets called by the big blind, who maybe there are 200 big blinds affected, that's going to be a different scenario. But very generally, the more middle strength, the more like Jack, 10, 9, 8, 7 type stuff, the more middling and connected, wet, volatile, the better it's going to be for pre-flop caller. And the more dry and static and kind of discombobulated, and the fewer middling cards, the more like Broadway cards and then bricks, that's going to typically favor pre-flop raiser. And really, when we're talking about pre-flop raiser versus pre-flop caller, it's often more important to determine who's got the initiative or who's got most incentive to bet than it is to say, you know, whose board is this. The topic of whose board is like which board favors which range is not as easy as just saying A or B. I did a video on range advantage. If you go back and watch the video on range advantage, it's going to get into all of these topics in a lot of detail, but we'll just say very generally speaking, the more middling connected, the wetter, the more volatile the board is, the better it is for pre-flop callers range in general, and the more static and dry, discombobulated the board is, that's going to be pre-flop raiser's board, especially when we're talking about who has more incentive to bet, as opposed to simply just saying who's got the stronger range. When to raise sets, in general, we could say that the more volatile the flop is, the more incentive you have to raise immediately, because things can change. You know, there's going to be, if the flop comes out 7-6-5 two-tone and you've got pocket sixes, you've got a very strong hand, but there's a lot of turn cards that can change that. So as a rule of thumb, let's try to get value while we can. And we're not going to be able to get value from draws once they beat us, and we're not going to be able to get value from the not draws once all the draws hit. So the more volatile the flop is, you know, the smaller the cards are on the flop, the more connected they are, and the more suited kind of activity we've got going on, the more incentive we've got to raise immediately. The more static the board is, the less incentive we have to raise immediately. We can wait, until there's more draws that open up, A, to get value from, and B, to make sure that we don't allow action killers to come off on the next street. And also, the deeper the stacks are, the more incentive you have to go for a raise and start building a pot immediately and take control of the betting, because you want to be the one that sizes the bets, especially, in general, this is going to be the case. But I was going to say especially when you're trying to get stacks in, but I guess that's not really the way that I should say it. It's especially obvious to see the reason when you're trying to get stacks in. But just thinking about it in those terms makes it easier to see why you'd want to, check raise the flop when you're very deep stacked. But maybe you could afford to wait for a later street if you're playing with a pretty small stacked pot ratio, where you could check call the flop, and even if the turn goes check check, it's not going to be much of a trick to jam the river without it being a massive overbet. If you've got a bunch of money behind, you might want to go check raise on the flop to build a bigger pot, and then you can start taking control of the bet sizing and try to get your stack in by the river without making it an overbet. So, it's also going to be true if stacks are very, very deep and you've got no chance of getting stacks in. But I think that looking at it from the perspective of a person trying to get their stack in illustrates why this is the case. And also, if you're playing against a very aggressive opponent, whether you're in position or out of position, the more aggressive your opponent is, the more likely he is to continue barreling, the better the odds are that your opponent's going to give you a chance on the next street to go for a check raise, or if you're in position to go ahead and raise. And I'm kind of tempted to say that when you're out of position, you might feel a little bit more pressure to go ahead and get the check raise in earlier, whereas when you're in position, you can wait, because if your opponent continues to bet, then you can wait to raise, and if your opponent checks the street, you can take over the aggression. But the more I thought about that, the more I thought, that really isn't the case, because even out of position, you still have a lot of incentive to wait it out if your opponent's likely to be aggressive, because let's say that your opponent's going to make more aggro, betting, bluffing, thin value bet mistakes than he's going to make mistakes calling against a check raise. So he's going to make more aggro mistakes than he will calling mistakes versus a check raise. Then very often, if you were to wait for the turn, like you're going to check call the flop with your set, and then you're going to look to check raise the turn. Well, when you check and it goes, you check and your opponent checks back, you might feel like, well, damn, I should have went for the flop check raise. But in those situations where it looks like you paid the ultimate price by being out of position, and to a degree you definitely did, because you weren't able to get at least a single bet in, but really a lot of the hands that are going to check back the turn, most likely we're not going to call a check raise on the flop anyway. So just in general, the more aggressively your opponent's betting, the longer you can wait. Like you can wait till, sometimes you should wait till the river against a player that's just going to barrel off a lot. And the more stationy your opponent is, the better you should feel about check raising early on. And also, the deeper the stacks are, the earlier on you might want to go for that check raise. And the more static the board is, the more you can wait. The more volatile and wet the board is, the quicker you want to go for the raise. So hopefully that helps. And when to donk bet. So this is pretty simple to say, actually. You should open a donk betting range when you have a range advantage and you expect your opponent to check back a lot of flops. So it's not sufficient that one of those things be the case. They actually both have to be the case for it to make sense to open a donk betting range. When you're out of position and you called pre-flop and the flop comes out, you want the flop to favor your range so that you're going to have a lot of bluffs that will want to put a lot of pressure on your opponent's like single pairs by betting flop, betting turn, and betting river. That has to be the case, where you're going to have bluffs that want to put a lot of pressure on, and you're going to have value hands that want 3 streets. But you also have to know that your opponent's going to do a lot of checking back on the flop, because if you know your opponent's going to c-bet the flop anyway, you don't have any incentive to bet yourself. You're going to be better off either taking a check raise with your big hands and check raise with some of your bluffs type line, or check call most of your range on the flop, and then play turns and rivers. If you do have the range advantage, then you're going to have some hands that want to go for 3 streets, and you're going to want to balance that with bluffs, and some of your bluffs will need to go 3 streets to apply enough pressure to get the folds you want. And if you expect that your opponent's going to recognize that and do a lot of checking back on the flop for pot control, then that's when you ought to be thinking of opening up a donk betting range. Usually it's when there's 2 good players playing against each other, and the player that's in position realizes that the player that's out of position is a pretty reasonable player, and the player that's out of position knows that their opponent that's in position is a pretty reasonable player, and he might, the player that's the pre-flop raise or in position might make a range check on 9, 8, 7, 2-tone. So even if they have pocket aces, they might go ahead and check back, maybe even check their entire range, even if they've got pocket 10s for top set. Maybe they'll even check that back to protect the rest of the range. So if that's the dynamic, then that's when you ought to be opening up a donk betting range. So there you go, video's over. That's it. And of course the video is not over. We're just kind of getting started, right? So understanding the way ranges